Hello, everybody. This is the Based Bible Study. Let's start by praying. Great God and Heavenly Father, we come to you today reverently and excitedly to get to grips with another bit of your word, to find truths, again, that are not fashionable, but are grounded and based on reality, based on your reality. We ask that as we look at this passage from Galatians and all the interesting things that are hidden in there, it wouldn't just be head knowledge, it would go into our hearts and change us, and that we would go out into the world and represent you better. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Great. The other exciting news this week is we've got a new fancy visualization for the Bible passages. Is everyone hyped for that?
Tremendously.
I think until you see it, you're not going to understand quite how exciting this is. Here we go. So this is Galatians 5. For freedom, Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ, who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from grace, for through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love. Prince of Palmer says, it's fun but hard to read along. Okay, well, maybe I'll fiddle with it for next week. But if you can hear the words from me, that's surely that's half the battle.
Yeah.
Great. So we've got lots to talk about this week. For people who are not so familiar with the jargon and the concepts, I'm going to try and make sure you can keep up with the discussion, because I want this to be not just for people who want to go in depth, also for people hearing these ideas for the first time. I'm going to assume that people at least know what circumcision is, but maybe we'll talk about why it's part of the Jewish religious practices and how that reflects on this that Paul was writing. And probably the headline topic that we're talking about today is justification. Does anybody want to give me like a quick potted definition for justification? I've often heard it as, I think the way it's often done in sermons is it's just as if I'd never sinned.
Yeah, that's a good extra way to put it. I've typically viewed it as, you can imagine you're in a courtroom. What are you going to say when you're called guilty? And if you go to something you did, you're justifying yourself. If you go to something Christ did, you're justified in Christ.
That's a good point.
So I guess it's related to kind of concepts of guilt and being in a courtroom and being accused of something, isn't it? In this case, we're talking about the concept that we are guilty and God is the judge. And the question is, how is that guilt put right? And this passage kind of dives off into two directions, doesn't it? It says one option is you're saved by grace, and the other option is that you continue under the law. That might be confusing to some people. Does anyone want to explain that a little bit? Sorry, I know this is like the simple definitions bit at the top, but I don't want us to assume that the viewers are going to understand all these ideas.
Well, I guess I'll go for the law angle if you like.
Yeah.
So because with a background with the Galatians, they have been subjected to, well, I think they've been the Jewish lawmakers have come into Galatia and tried to persuade them of the truth of Judaism. And so the law is essentially the tenets of the Jewish faith set forth in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and through Genesis and Exodus as well.
Yes. There's a covenant that God set up with originally with Abraham. In fact, it might be useful, I guess, if we were to read that bit. Shall we dive off and look at some Genesis, and then we can come back to Galatians in a sec? How does that sound as a plan?
Sounds good.
I don't even have it. Do I have it ready to go? No, I thought I had it ready to load. Let's do that in a minute. So we'll go to Genesis in a sec, but whilst I load that up, I think it might be interesting to briefly discuss this concept of a yoke of slavery. How is it the case that now that I think the idea Paul's putting across here is, now that you've become a Christian, now you've decided to follow Jesus, you're no longer a slave. I don't think he's talking about literal slavery, but also people might think, if you follow Jesus, you have to follow way more rules. So surely, if anything, you're more of a slave. Does anyone want to take a crack at what he's
I'm not
talking
sure
about?
the way more rules, because I'll be debating that later on in the chapter. In the chapter, but the theory set forth that I read was that the freedom from the yoke of slavery is not literal bondage by another person, but the bondage of sin. So Christ frees you from your sins.
Yes, but that seems, I think that will seem odd to people. Isn't sinning breaking the law, and therefore you have more freedom if you sin?
You?
There's a move of the law being from something like, if you break the government's law, you are punished without any patronage from the state, because the state, you're just a mere citizen. But if you break the house law that you live under, there's the opportunity that the family rescinds your sin from something. Like usually it's a work done by an older brother or something. Like, if you crash the car, the government's gonna want money, the insurance company's gonna want money. Like there's gonna be a court case. But what's the family relationship there? Is your dad gonna throw you out of the house for it? Maybe, but there's a different kind of relationship in Christ, where there's still a law, but it's now like the house law rather than the civil law. And there's a different thing there. Yeah.
What I have here in sort of my Bible, in the sort of liner notes on it, it says that the yoke of bondage is the law. It mistakes the lesser reality, its rules and regulations, its externals for the greater reality, God, who produced the law and to whom the externals point. The law in this sense includes the initiatory requirements to be circumcised, an obligation to perfectly obey the whole law, being justified by law, trying to establish one's own righteousness under the law, continuing bondage and sin, dependence on the flesh, corrupt human nature, alienation from Christ in the grave, which Christ calls labor, and being heavy laden. So that's kind of my understanding, I guess what you could call the the Orthodox understanding of what it means by the yoke in this context. So the yoke is sort of it has a purpose, right? Just like a yoke on an animal. It's something you pull and whatnot to get a job done. But it is a heavy burden that you have to carry. And that's kind of the yoke of the law of Moses.
So we've got two possible solutions to this conundrum of what is the yoke of slavery referring to. I'm going to suggest the way that we solve this is we look at the context. So at the beginning of the bit that you can see there is, for freedom, Christ has set us free. So I think that's clearly carrying on from the end of the previous chapter. So possibly I'm thinking we should do our diversion to Genesis, and then maybe we should pull up the end of Galatians 4 and see. But it's talking about just as a preview. Then the end of Galatians 4 is talking about the difference between the two women who Abraham had children by. So it's all wrapped up with Abraham. So I think it'll make more sense if we do the excursion into Genesis, look at Abraham, and then come back and we can discuss. So here is Genesis 17, starting at verse 9. And this is where circumcision comes from a Jewish context. So God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations." By the way, God's just promised Abraham a bunch of great stuff. So this is like Abraham's side of the deal. So there's going to be a covenant, a two-sided covenant between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring, both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall be circumcised, so my covenant will be in your flesh. I'm seeing some struggles keeping up with this software. I'll fix it for next week. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. So there you go. That's the origin story for circumcision. Basically, as a sign of the covenant that God has with Abraham and his descendants, who of course become the Jews, he requires all the males of every following generation to be circumcised. So the context is Paul, who was a Jew, talking to a bunch of people who are Jews who have decided to follow Christ. Paul is saying this sign of circumcision is no longer needed. And in fact, the reason that it's no longer needed is because you have swapped from being part of the promises given to Abraham to a new set of promises, and like a new covenant. Would you guys agree more or less with that summary? Take silence as a yes.
No, I would agree with that. So yeah, no, I would definitely agree with what you said. So the circumcision was sort of a covenant for the Jews to sort of keep the law and whatnot, but as you say, we have a new. I hate to use the word dispensation because of dispensationalism, but yeah, there it is.
What is dispensationalism?
Dispensationalism is kind of something you run into in evangelical and certain Pentecostal circles, and basically it's like the idea that, you know, just like that Christ is going to come back and have like a new kingdom like before the final judgment. So it's kind of at odds with classic biblical teaching. So it's a modern innovation is essentially what it is in terms of history going forward from the age of the church into the founding of the new Israel in Israel, literally, and then Christ comes back to Israel and creates, his kingdom on earth before the final judgment.
So the dispensations in the word dispensationalism is the ages of time. Is that right? It's like God divides up history into these sections,
right,
and deals differently with people in different dispensations, I guess.
Yeah.
I never liked the dispensation argument because it's saying that there's some kind of divide between God's blessings and you can always fall back on old blessing. I guess at least in an American context, a lot of people use this to justify the support for Israel and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, it's really an American thing is what it is. And it's a pretty new idea. And basically it's the idea that we basically have to prepare Israel for being for sort of rebuilding Jerusalem, for the new one to sort of spring up in its place. It's a pretty weird theology.
Yeah, and there's talk in Revelation, isn't there, of 1,000 years, and the view in dispensationalism is that itself is another dispensation.
Yeah.
We
Right.
should expect
Yeah.
before Christ comes back, there will be this period of time.
Yep.
No, I think it's like
That's
he
called
comes back and then
premillennialism.
yeah, he comes back. There's something that happens, then some new kingdom, and then he has to do something again, and then it's
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, it's like it's like double tap Jesus is what it is. So
Yeah.
so yeah,
I
there's
I
the
consider
rapture.
I
Okay.
sorry. I'll sometimes joke, oh, the second coming already happened. It was Pentecost,
Yeah.
and I mean, yeah, because he came back, gave the Holy Spirit,
interesting.
and yeah, like he technically came back a second time to Paul in that time.
So you're
period.
waiting for the third coming on that basis.
Nah, I don't know what. I don't number them.
Final
Because, like, the
judgment.
Bible, yeah, the judgment. I don't think the Bible ever explicitly says like second coming, just merely come again. And
Right.
so like there's no real statement that he can't come again multiple times. This is like kind of fringe theology though. I'm just like questioning the entire American theological view. So like I'll sometimes none of this is something that I explicitly believe. It's just thoughts that I've had. It's like, well, like if it never says second coming, but merely come again. I mean, like we already see multiple times Jesus comes back in the New Testament. Like he comes back for Paul, he comes back for John in Revelation, he comes back for Pentecost, he comes back for the judgment one day. He also comes back to throw Satan again. So he's going to come back multiple times in the future, from what I can understand from scripture. There's no singular return. He's going to come back multiple times. And we've already seen at least like 4 or 5 of them in scripture.
So this that I'm showing now is the end of the previous chapter, Galatians 4. And Abraham here is, so it's talking about Abraham's 2 children. He was promised all of these things via his offspring, but he and his wife, Sarah, were not able to have a child. So in an attempt to help God out, they decided, well, clearly we need Abraham to sleep with our with this slave that we have, and therefore they had a child called Ishmael, and then God said, no, that was not my plan. So this is saying the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. That's a quote from Genesis. And then he says, so brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. And hence it then goes on to say, and therefore we're not ourselves slaves, but we're free. So does that clear things up? If anything, I'm a little bit more confused, I think, right now. So it's not as simple as saying that the slavery is being part of the law, because it was through the child of the free woman that the Jews followed the Old Testament law, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. I hear you. It's just
I think you're probably. I think it probably doesn't matter which way we interpret it, but I'm currently not feeling confident to pronounce on which one of these is correct.
Yeah.
A question we never quite answered was, why would it be a perception that being a slave to sin is possible? Isn't that a contradiction? Does anyone? I've got an answer for that, but does anyone else want to chip in there?
I'll go with the answer Luther kind of gave in on the bondage of the will, where like he kind of seems to argue that like nobody really has full free will. Everyone's in different degrees of bondage to sin. Christ was completely free from sin, and so he's our great liberator. And the more you obey Christ, bow to Christ, and give up your preferences for Christ, the more freer in will you will become to worship God. And the more you walk away from that, the more enslaved to the bondage of to sin you will become. There's like this gradient that seems to occur, and like your sanctification is the process of you getting freer will through the process of baptism to cleanse yourself from the worldly spirit that's evil, and like the learning of the word and the commitment of his promises and believing in those promises.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and didn't
And that
Luther?
will- No, go on.
Speaking to that point you were talking about with free will, Luther and whatnot, didn't he have that great line where he said, "Man is an ass, either ridden by God or the devil"? Right.
That's a great line.
But
So
that was
here's a
Luther,
quote from-
wasn't it?
I don't know. It sounds like something Luther would say, but that's not something I
Okay.
remember.
Not to at all to demean the wonderful Martin Luther, but I've got a quote from somebody who arguably is even higher in my respect. Jesus, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." Weird concept for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, I think, but it does make a lot of. I think it makes a lot of sense. If you are living a totally free, quote unquote, lifestyle where you're just a vice addicted, pleasure seeking animal, you aren't actually free. True freedom is in having the capacity to overrule those lower desires with something that's greater. There's a great C.S. Lewis quote about that, isn't there? I'll find it. Somebody else talk for a second.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. The Lord has blessed us with many material things, right? He's blessed us with food. He's blessed us with leisure. He's blessed us with knowledge, and he's blessed us with carnal desires, which carried out when carried out within the marital bed, so to speak. But all of these things can become slave masters themselves. So when these are no longer things to enrich your life, but become the focus of your life, then you build your life around these things, and you're a slave to them, slave to your passions. And I think we've all kind of been there to some degree. Slave to video games, slave to sloth, slave to food, slave to sex.
Here's the quote from C.S. Lewis: "We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We're far too easily pleased." I love that quote, so I roll it out whenever I can.
That's great.
Yeah. There's so much in this first section, and as always, I'm looking at the time and thinking I haven't paced this at all well. But yes, I would say probably if I had to make a snap decision, and this is a live stream after all, and what else are live streams for except for snap decisions? I'm going to plump for this past the beginning of Galatians 5, talking about slavery to sin rather than slavery to the law, because the path that Paul is including himself as being a part of was coming in through the law, as it were. So I think he makes the point later in the passage that you were making, Mr. Patriarch. So in a way, if the passage is making both points, does it really matter? Yeah. So does anyone have anything else to say about the first 6 verses, or should we carry on? Because there's so much more richness here.
I think for the first 6 verses as well. Not to hold this up to it too longer, but the reason he makes the point to say, sorry, I just need to get the verse up so I can see which part I'm referencing. Because it talks about adherence to the law, and it says about Christ is invalidated. Is that in this part?
Christ will be of no advantage to you.
Yeah, because it says, because when I read up on this part, it was basically saying if you don't follow Judaism to the letter, you basically invalidated the circumcision anyway, which I think is important for, especially in our current situation where people join the faith and they've been baptized and they go to church once a Sunday, and therefore they say they're saved. and all they're doing is keeping up the practices of the law and not following the actual teachings of the heart.
Mm-hmm. I've often heard it said that all other religions apart from Christianity rely on you following the rules properly in order to be accepted, and Christianity is the only one that has an alternative. Now, I don't know if somebody could bring forth an example. I've never heard one that counteracts that, but certainly it is the case that it's unusual, I would say. All of the impulses in the human heart are to work a bit harder, try a bit more, be more moral. And also most people's opinion is, well, I'm not perfect, but there's a threshold that I'll be acceptable at, which is always just mysteriously slightly lower than wherever I'm at. And it doesn't matter who you talk to. They could be a murderer on death row. They'll still consider themselves to be justified by their own works. But God, in a way, gave us the law and said, well, look, you don't need to wonder about this. You're not acceptable. Like, it's not like 10% of you are good enough and the others have to wonder. None of you are good enough. The law is extremely difficult to follow. In fact, impossible for humans to follow. And if you're going to keep trying the law, yeah, you're going to have to follow the whole thing. So, yeah, if you're still requiring circumcision as your way to be acceptable to God, you're also going to have to follow the other hundreds of laws, many of which are involve, for example, the 10th commandment is thou shalt not covet. So anybody who is attempting to be pleasing to God through circumcision also has to never at a moment of their life have been covetous. Good luck.
Yeah. No, definitely. And I was like that one too. It's like, thou shalt not covet. And I'm like, so socialism is evil.
Yeah, it turns out that if you try to analyze human behavior without including original sin, you end up with some weird results. People will disagree on what original sin, what the mechanism for there is. But all I mean is, like, human beings have this clear proclivity to sin, to the point where calling it slavery to sin makes absolute sense. And the idea that you could just arrange the world in such a way that they start to behave correctly is foolhardy, I would argue. Good. Let's do Galatians 5 verses 7 to 12. While the animation plays. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is. But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. I wish those who unsettle you would emasculate themselves. I think, just in case anybody missed the little phrase at the end there, which has possibly been softened in my translation a little bit. What he's saying is, all these people are arguing that you should carry on circumcising, right? Cutting off the foreskin. And he says, well, frankly, I wish those people who are still circumcising would just go the whole way and cut off their entire, male member. Strong words from
transition to sin.
Yeah. No, and in mine here it says, I could wish that those who trouble you would even cut themselves off. So,
which is even more even more sack. It's very clear, as I understand it, in the original language. The point that he's making, he's saying, you've cut a bit off your penis, just get rid of the whole thing, and then come at me. Which was a military tactic used at one point in the Old Testament, but that's a story for another day.
Yeah.
So Paul clearly here has enormous passion, right, for the people that he's writing to, this is not a religious book that is meek and mild. He's going full at it. He is, I think, incandescent with rage at the people who are trying to, in his mind, mislead the congregation and potentially ruin their lives, take them away from the joy we can have in this life of a right relationship with God, and then potentially doom you for eternity. So I'm with Paul on this one. What about you guys?
Yeah, no, I would agree. The notion that by sticking to some, rabbinic, legalistic traditions and whatnot is going to save your soul is foolhardy. There are people who do it, but if it's for a religious purposes and whatnot, you're barking up the wrong tree. And Paul's extremely clear about that.
Now, some people will say, does that mean that if you're circumcised, you're outside of the Christian faith? And that would be especially shocking, I think, to some parts of the world which could still continue to practice circumcision, male circumcision, as I understand it, very popular in the United States, for example.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it would necessarily leave you outside the faith, because verse 6 makes that fairly clear. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor so uncircumcision. But I agree that it's... Sorry, you carry on, Mr. Patriarch.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and I was thinking about this myself, and the other thing, too, to keep in mind is, who is he talking to, and who is Paul himself? They're all Jews, and they've all been circumcised, right? So, I mean, I don't think saying that you're circumcised puts you outside of the, the fold of the church. But what it does mean is that if you're going to do circumcision for the purposes of trying to sort of set yourself apart and, spiritually sort of purify yourself and whatever, that's not going to work. And if you're going to try and hold yourself to that standard, you'll be judged by that standard. I think that's what that means.
He's kind of picked this as his hill to die on, I would argue, not because circumcision itself is such a particularly big issue, but because it's symbolic of an entire attitude. In fact, I believe Paul actually circumcised Titus in order that he would be a more effective evangelist to a certain group. So in a different context, Paul actually commended people who are Christians to be circumcised for a very particular purpose. But the point he's making here is wider, and it's about this change that's happened of perspectives of, are we following all of the laws that God gave to the nation of Israel, or are we entering into this new era where God is opening up the door to the entire world and he's changing the rules, where no longer is it based on our works, it's based on the works of Christ?
Yeah, well, that sounds right on the money to me.
Well, it's important to... I think it's maybe dangerous to say changing the rules so much as falling back on an older set of rules from Melchizedek. The often term that like Christ is from the line of Melchizedek rather than Moses. Not Moses. The priestly Leviticus.
David.
Levi. Well, like he's from the kingly line of David, but his priestly line is from Melchizedek. And I think because David was a priest of Melchizedek. But it's important to remember that like it's only those under Levi's priesthood that have to follow the Old Testament laws. The rest of the world wasn't really held to that standard. It was before Moses there was like maybe like 7 laws. Like don't torture animals, don't kill, don't steal. Like basically the 10 Commandments are in many ways like the summation of the law before Moses, and like those tablets are like, okay, from here on out we're doing like additions to this, but this is like the heart of the law that we're basing off of. So Moses' 10 Commandments were kind of that like pre-Mosaic view of the world of morality that Moses codified to then build off of. We're kind of falling back onto the pre-Mosaic rule set that you see throughout pre-Moses, like before Moses in the Old Testament, where like God says, yeah, don't don't kill, like with Seth and not Seth, with Cain and Abel, don't kill, with Adam and Eve, don't steal, don't and like all kinds of things like that. There's like a rule set before Moses that mankind was kind of expected to follow, like a baseline morality, and then the Levi system was more to like specify who's the perfect one, who will follow all of this to be your savior.
We've got to do Romans 7 at some point to look about what the effects of bringing the law into the world were. I would argue the number one purpose of a lot of the law was to point forwards to Jesus, and another big purpose of it was to highlight how impossible it was to live up to God's standard. But yes, one way or another, Jesus was the fulfillment of the law, right? He didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Is that what he says? In that Jesus, genuinely being the only human not tainted by sin, was actually able to fulfill it, and that meant that he had, as it were, a death spare. He had one death going free, and he offered it for all of mankind. I think that's more or less how the maths works out. I'm aware there's enormous amount of literature, of scholarly debate about how all this works, but I'm being very casual about it.
Yeah.
Let's carry on. Great. So, works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. So there's a big list of things that everybody would totally
I think you
see as
skipped a
bad
bit,
these days,
Lambda.
right?
Did you?
Did I miss the passage?
I think you missed 13 to 16, 13 to 18.
Oh, you're totally right. Oh, well,
I mean, we can go right down to discussing the sins, because I think that's going to be a long and hearty discussion.
let's
But
come back to the sins.
Don't miss a
Thanks for
bit of
pointing that
God's
out.
word.
Yeah, we'll carry on in the order that exists in the Bible, rather than doing it out of order. But I probably won't bother to read that passage again when we get to it. So here we are, 13 to 18. Good pointing that out. Thanks, Northern Man. For you were called to freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another. But as I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. For the desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are opposed to each other, to keep you from doing the things that you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. So freedom. This is kind of the big rallying cry of our age, right? We want freedom. Is that what it's talking about?
Not that kind of freedom. Freedom in Christ, not libertarian kind of freedom.
I think libertinist freedom, not libertarian freedom, I would argue. But that's a different topic.
Could you can you just explain that briefly? What's the libertine freedom?
Libertine freedom, I'd argue, is the want to experience everything freedom. So believing that laws are in place to restrict you from doing things that would be pleasurable. Mm-hmm. Whereas libertarianism would argue that basic principles are in place for you to prevent you from harming yourself and others.
Mm-hmm. What do we think about the whole law being fulfilled in "You shall love your neighbor as yourself"?
I think it does connect together to a large extent. I mean, if you love your neighbor as yourself, you're not going to covet what they want. You're not going to, steal his wife. You're not going to kill him. You're not going to murder him. You're not going to bear false witness. And by not bearing false witness, you're going to share, when inquired about it, you're going to share the gospel with them and try and, lead a good and godly life. So I think it's all connected in that.
It's a useful thing to keep in the back of your mind when trying to understand the law. I would say, because some bits of the law, you go deep into Leviticus and you're like, what is going on here? Are these just completely arbitrary? Where did these come from?
I think there is a few early Christian books that try to make sense of that. I think the Epistle of Barnabas is one of my favorite. Not the Gospel of Barnabas. The Gospel of Barnabas is a fiction book written like 1,000 years after Jesus. The Epistle of Barnabas appears to be from possibly the Apostle. And he goes on a very long expounding on for example, the dietary law. And he kind of says, well, maybe we should interpret this as understanding that animals are typologies for personalities. And so he goes like, the owl steals its food. No, not the owl. The vulture steals its food. So don't eat as in don't, like, eating in the word always has to do with like consuming the word of God, like studying it together, growing together. It's like those consuming, like, man does not live by bread alone, but also the word of God. So the word of God has often been associated to the act of eating. And so this writer, who might have been Barnabas the Apostle, or probably one of his students, says, like, our teacher told us don't eat vultures because people who are like vultures will steal the word from you and attack you when you're weak. And it's like, what does it mean? Don't eat shellfish. Well, shellfish eat the filth of the bottom. So these are like bottom feeders who are going to poison your relationship with God by getting stuck in every little tiny dirt that they can find. And it goes in like, what does it mean that we should only eat animals that have like 2 toes, like sheep? And it goes into this explanation. Well, those who act like those with 2 feet walk with one foot in, one toe in this world and 1 toe in the next, and so this is wise. And so he goes on this huge expounding on how to like revision the dietary law as something in the light of the spirit rather than the flesh. And I actually really enjoyed that because it made sense of a lot of the Old Testament. And you can start expanding on that with his lessons on like other things, like the famous verse of mixed fabrics. So what the hell does mixed fabrics have to do with holiness? And if you look into it, it's because I forget which fabrics they are, but one of the fabrics are the clothing that priests would wear, and the other fabric is the clothing that princes like noble families would wear. And so the lesson is, don't wear both. Choose one. Don't be both in the world and in the word. Choose either the clothing of a priest or the clothing of a nobleman. Which do you want, the riches or the heavenly riches? And suddenly it all makes a hell of a lot more sense. Because it just like it follows a lot with what Jesus was saying.
I think this verse is really great. If you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Because in one sentence, it's both explained how we're no longer required to follow the law, but also in our freedom, we're not then. It doesn't make sense to say, well, having been freed from the law, I'm going to go and continue to be completely debauched and evil, because the only way that you can be free from the law is if you are led by the Spirit. So being led by the Spirit is a nice link to the passage we looked at last week, when you might remember Jesus going off into the wilderness. Why did he do that? He was led by the Spirit. It's actually a more powerful guide to have a spirit, the Spirit of God leading you, than a rule book. I always used to be really annoyed that God hadn't given us a completely thorough guide in the Bible. I was looking at modern dilemmas morally and thinking, why doesn't the Bible address this? Well, clearly a law book is what I was wanting. And it's surprising how many people want to be under a law that they can't keep. So it really requires a level of humility to accept the freedom in this case, I would say. I can tell you're all just champing at the bit to talk about that giant list of works of the flesh. So
I think that's going to be the most interesting part of this chapter.
Yeah. Should we bring it up? So I won't read it again. But it's an interesting list, isn't it? What jumped out to you guys from this list?
Number 1, God rejects simps. Come on, guys.
So,
sexual
immorality is probably broader than just simping.
I think that I like, for this one, I enjoy the new. This is the NIV, right? You're using the New International Version.
These are actually ESV, but yeah.
ESV. Well, yeah, because in the King James Version, the first one is adultery, but sexual immorality is far more all-encompassing, and I think that that's very interesting.
So the aspect of simping that people criticize these days is the weak sort of beta attitude, isn't it? It's the fact that these people are so reduced in status compared to another person that they're exchanging small amounts of internet points for actual time and money and attention, and that is a kind of separate discussion. But what you point out is totally correct, that the drive that has led people to this state in life is that they're driven around by their sexual aspect to their nature, that they're so totally driven by having seen an image of somebody they can't even properly interact with, but they're just driven wild by the magnetism of this sexual drive, that their life goes totally off the rails. They end up as very obvious fools. So yes, I think we can definitely include that topic as part of one of the works of the flesh. But obviously sexual immorality is much broader than that. I would argue that the only place that it's appropriate to indulge the sexual drive is as a part of marriage. So I'd put any kind of sexual activity, masturbation, looking at porn, playing with, doing inappropriate things with a partner who you're not yet married to, all of those things, works of the flesh. Not a popular opinion these days, but
yeah, lambda. You're just trying to hold people down, right?
But evident, it says. So actually, although I feel like a lot of people might hear me say that and think that's preposterous, looking at the Word of God, perhaps if they thought a bit deeper, they would realize that I was correct.
Yeah, it's unfortunately that people will ignore this particular passage. I'll especially the modern church will just casually ignore Paul a lot. Liberal Christianity, I don't even know if I'm comfortable using the term liberal Christianity, but I think I should use the term progressive Christianity because it's trying to progress past Paul.
They call it there's a term Box Day uses, which I think is really good to refer to these people. He calls it churchianity. So it's churchianity. So yes. I'm like, that's actually pretty good.
Following the church, but not necessarily following Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Follow a church, not even the church,
Yes.
And that's one of the interesting things about this. And you guys bring up good points. The Bible does harp on a lot about sexual sins and the dangers of sexual sins and whatnot. And you might be thinking, why? Some bonehead like Thaddeus Russell read this and be like, oh, the Bible's all about, repression of the sexual desires. We need to liberate ourselves and whatnot. And what's truth anyways, man? that sort of thing. But sexual sin particularly is, I think it gets a lot of playtime because it's really important in sort of how the devil gets you, right? So I made a tweet the other day, and it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek tweet, and I think I said something like, most moral calamities and turning away from God begin with, I want my pee-pee to feel good. And I honestly think that's true.
Sorry, I read a really good quote on that point that was like, once you commit one sin, it also becomes very easy to commit the other sins as well. And through the sin of the pee-pee, it becomes very easy to then move on to more sins.
It's the gateway sin.
No, and the thing too is like it's obviously it's a natural human impulse, that desire for sex and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But the thing is I'm not going to go into too much, no graphic detail or anything. But in my life, in my sort of dark period, let's just say, I that was sort of what sort of got me in there, and I went from kind of like a pretty somewhat serious evangelical Christian to sort of like kind of deistic. And the reason why, I was never an atheist, but the reason why is I wanted the pee-pee to feel good. Like that's literally what it was. And like at the time I was like, oh, I had all these arguments and whatnot, but really that's what it was. Like I was just like, no, I don't want to do things God's way because basically I'm I'm weak, and instead of saying I don't want to do things God's way because I'm weak and sinful, Lord, please give me strength, I was just I made arguments to myself, bullshit arguments as to why that wasn't the case. So and sex is just such a powerful tool of the enemy. It really can be. So just the effects that even pornography has, let alone anything else. Pornography is almost even worse in my opinion because it's so accessible and it just saps your energy in a way that you don't even get with regular intercourse. Because at least with that you need to go out and meet people. With pornography, you're just sort of like staring at a screen in isolation. You get laid to screens, you entertain yourself with screens, your whole life's a screen. So it's very dehumanizing.
Cringewalker has a relevant meme on the topic.
This is awful.
There you go.
Okay, an awful meme. Yes, the Vosh take is embrace your needs, and of course, then you end up, forgive my French, a fat fuck with a horrible life. But and the other side of the argument is be purity, which is also very wise. You'll become a very very good asset of the church. But then of course the pretty much middle ground approach, which is I guess like more of a decent Christian approach, is to just find a wife and then enjoy. Yeah, the patriarch, become a patriarch, right? It's pretty much simple as like you get the fleshy desires and the emotional desires all in one. Oh wow, optimization, efficiency.
Yeah, I saw a diagram that looked very similar to that one somebody else made on the topic of Galatians, and their argument was that the path being laid out that we should follow was true liberty, that is the freedom from having to sin, and then the two ways that you could fall off either side was either falling off on the side of I can't remember what the terms that they I'm sure they alliterated if somebody's thought about them, but on one side was essentially you were free from the law and therefore you just lived whatever way you liked, and the other side was you're still captive to the law.
Yeah, and like again, the primitive man viewed law as this burden you have to do to get close to God, and the saved man views the law as, oh, when I'm right with God, I'll do this without being told, and that's what you should be. You should look at the law as this is what I'll become, without any real hatred of it when I love God. And you can measure your relationship with God by how much you enjoy these things. Because a lot of people think, oh, you have to follow the law, be miserable, and then you'll get the reward in the afterlife. No. You follow Christ's example. You start obeying the law purely because you love it, and because it makes you feel closer to God. And it is an act, like it is the law. Obedience to the law is a product of how much you love God. It's not how you get to love of God. Like if you love God, you'll find you're following the law because it's a product of it. It's a descriptive term, not a prescriptive term. And I think this is what Jesus pretty much showed. Like the perfect love of the Father and the Son between each other produced a man of perfect obedience to the law. Not because he had to do it to get there, but because he had it, and so that was the outflow of it. This is a description of Jesus because of that perfect relationship.
I feel like we should have a brief discussion on a few more of these because they're quite fun. So impurity, anyone got any thoughts on that? Or sensuality?
Pentecostal.
I'm just because I'm using the King James version. They are slightly different. So
go on. What have you got there?
So I've got the second one is it's adultery, then fornication, uncleanness, and lavishness. And the uncleanness, especially, I mean, wash yourself, please. But the lavishness is a good one because I think that the lavishness is like that typical bourgeois version of human beings where they drink the sweetest wine and eat the best food, and then they get gout. Like, it's bad for you to live that high-end life because it's not what your body was built for, and it's not what God intended for you.
Yeah, I've been practicing a bit of this in terms of exercise. Like I used to be like around like 250 in weight, and I would eat a lot. But I found that like as I've been gaining muscles and losing weight over the last like 2 or so years, I've been able to eat more because I want to, because my body needs it, because it has muscles now. Like I actually am starting to eat as much as I used to, but because I have muscles, it's because I need it, not because I want it. And that's because so I've made a revelation from this, even like into 2021, what I realized is, so I can have the same amount of food when my body needs it, and because I'm getting healthier, not because I'm a fat fucking not doing anything in my life.
Attend the Church of Iron, basically.
The lifestyle that we are sold culturally is accept yourself, enjoy yourself, you're worth it, buy things, indulge all of your fantasies, all the things that delight your eye. This is the modern way, and we're so glad we don't live in a terrible era of the past of repression. But who could honestly say that a day of lazing around, eating junk food, being depressed, and feeling victimized is actually a better day lived than being controlled with what you eat, exercising, working really hard? Maybe you've got children and you have to, they take an enormous amount of your time. You don't get proper amount of sleep, as much as you maybe would like. Maybe you wish that you could eat more food. But in my experience, having maybe not been on fully extreme ends of that spectrum, but having had days along that spectrum, there is a way in which I am physically sensualized. That's not a word. It is now. I've experienced things that give me that kind of brain pleasure, but been basically unhappy. And on other days, been extremely pleased with how my life is going. And I've been doing all the tough stuff. That is wisdom. It's very attractive. And I think people in our sphere, like Cringewalker, you used Sargon of Akkad, right? Or Carl as the exemplar of that. Now, he's not a Christian, but people like him are starting to see some of the wisdom that I would argue is most fully embellished in the Bible. Yeah,
it's. I think one of the core I guess you say one of the core flesh wisdoms of the Bible are that oftentimes when you resist your urges, you'll actually get what you wanted anyway a little bit later on, but at a higher quality. Like, yeah, I wanted to eat this much food, but now I'm eating it in a healthier sense. Like, I've done the work and resisted it, and now I'm actually kind of, I'm getting what I want, but slower and at a higher quality, because now my body is wanting that rather than just stacking up the fat. And I've also found this the same with many things with relationships, where like, you can like be an awkward idiot around women, and you'll out of like a desperation to like get there, or you can stop, review why you're acting like an idiot, and you'll find that like you'll actually get the relationship you want at a higher quality because it's a meaningful connection.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a good example of the switch in attitudes you're talking about is Proverbs about wine. So Proverbs 20 verse 1 says, "Wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise." So you think, oh, well, clearly then Proverbs is totally against wine. But if I can find it, there are other verses which talk about how wine gladdens a man's heart. It used appropriately. Wine is a gift from God. Oh, here's another one. Do not look at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup and goes down smoothly. So yeah, like you're saying about food, I think it would be wrong never to take advantage of the wonderful creation that God has made in terms of food. It's a way that we can experience something as a gift from God and turn the praise back up to Him. It's very different from saying that we should be eating as much as we like with no consideration of the other costs, right?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Sorcery. Oh, go on.
I haven't. No, sorcery is a good one. I mean, I don't know if you want to go, Cringer. I've got a good point on this one too.
You can go first.
So, sorcery, immediately you can see the fedora tipping atheist. He enters the room. What's it talking about? Witchcraft. Well, I looked this up, and apparently it's to do with poisoning, because the priests of this time would create potions in respect to evil gods, and most of the time these potions were poisonous and used for evil doing. So it was an attempt for Paul to get away from these older pagan gods and into the new God.
I think you're letting these fedora-wearing atheists live rent-free in your brain, Northern Man. You need to stop worrying about what they think.
Yes. What's the kind of cap that's in your photo?
That's a flat cap.
Yes. And embrace the flappy, reject the fedora. Yeah, so I was going to go with the same point. The Greek word for sorcery is pharmakeia, which is basically where we get the word for pharmacy from. It's the misuse of plants, basically. Mostly plants. It can include snake venom, too. Traditionally and historically, this was primarily used for abortion. So if you're wondering if the Bible is against abortion, here it is. It was also used for, obviously the corruption of youth when you went to like poison your children when they're not wanted. Infanticide is also included in this. Not just like the exposure, like the usual sense was like you throw your kid to the elements and let the elements kill them, but there's also the poisoning, and downright poisoning, like as in like killing someone that you don't like. This word often comes with. To be fair, this word often comes in a feminine terminology because it was usually the women who were the most experienced with foresting and non-agricultural, foresting and like wilderness life, whereas the men were like hunting. And so traditionally this word has a greater focus on like the female set of sins, whereas like you just had like fighting and stuff as the more masculine area of sins. So this is like bouncing between different male and female community sins that occur. But yes, traditionally sorcery is primarily around the two big issues of poisoning the embryo or poisoning the man. That's primarily what it is. As an example of this, when this was written, while this book was being written, a plant called Sepharum, I think. Let me look it up real quick.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, but I don't know the name.
Yeah, let me look it up real quick because it's not hard to find. Silphium, Silphium. I'll just link it in the chat. Was a plant that Rome primarily used for abortion. It was the primary crop that they grew for basically the explicit cause of aborting their children. They did this so much the plant went extinct, just to give a certain scale of that. They overcropped death. And the plant went extinct. One of the last known plant crops of it was owned by Nero, and he called it a curiosity because, like, they had all these documents of how it used to be used to, like, kill off a lot of people. For all the crap that Nero and the emperors got, they actually were pretty against this and made it illegal and tried to, like, get it out of society because it was kind of disgusting. But yeah, for most of the Roman Republic, this was the primary crop that was used by women to abort their children before they were born, to the extent that it went extinct. So you can imagine there were like hundreds of thousands of abortions yearly for the Roman Republic.
So many Roman thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah.
The leading cause of death over 2020 was in fact abortion.
I know every year it is.
Died from yeah.
It's been the same for every year.
When we think back on 2020 and the giant amount of unnecessary deaths, I think it's important that we remember the real cause. Enmity. Anyone got any comments on that? It seems similar to rivalries to me. A bit later. I guess this is talking about having a persistent, unnecessary, unresolved, irrational hatred for somebody or some group.
Yeah, it basically
in the
means
King James. Sorry, Mr. Patriarch. In the King James version, it is just hatred. So that's just a qualification, Mr. Patriarch.
No, every time I see enmity, all I think is don't be a hater. So yeah, that's basically what it is.
Okay, what about strife? What's your King James translation for strife?
Strife.
Great, we're on the same page for once. I don't immediately know what they're getting at with this one.
I'm not sure with strife. I didn't go too in depth with the strife.
So,
he is one of the 4 horsemen, so
is he strife?
Clearly, it's important.
It's basically talking about conflict, I guess. So, if your life is constantly filled with battles, you're spoiling for a fight all the time. That's a sign that you're living with a fleshly nature. We should be people of peace.
Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Well, Jesus did say, I've come to bring a sword, but question.
Yeah, but Jesus didn't live by his sword.
Did not, correct. Jealousy, that one is easy to understand, very hard to deal with.
That one is actually different in mine. And this was probably my last really fleshed out point on the sins. In the King James version, jealousy is emulation. And so one of the things that Calvin did in his writings was he compared that to envy, which is also later on for you. And he wanted to compare emulation to envy because it's one of those ones where if you don't do one, you're usually doing the other. And he used a good quote from Aristotle to define this. So I'm channeling my inner Sargon here. So Aristotle's quote was, "He whom emulates is grieved that another should excel him, not because of the worth of the virtue of that person in itself considered gives him uneasiness, but because he would wish to be superior. The envious man has no desire to excel, but is grieved at the excellence of other men." So emulation is trying to become a better person because you want to be superior to all of us, and envy is the hatred of that superiority.
I've heard the definition of jealousy, or I guess emulation, as being you are worried that somebody else is going to try and take what you have, and that fits maybe a bit better with, we think of God being a jealous God. Well, he's not worried, but he's protective. He's saying, you know, for example, you are my people. I'm going to be a jealous God. You're not allowed to go and worship another God. But that's interesting that this is a quality of the sinful nature, but also something ascribed to God.
Well,
right?
Again, like I think envy here, to envy is the one something higher, right? Is that what we were saying?
No. In this passage, it was envy was the hatred of the higher. So you hate rich people because they're rich, not because you aspire to be rich.
So I think there's a bit of a clue. I think maybe it's impossible for God to be envious, but it is possible for him to be. It's possible for him to be jealous that men are hoarding more men than he has, which is perfectly sensible. Like, why wouldn't God be jealous that liars and cheats are stealing more people than he has? Of course you'd be jealous. And there's nothing wrong with being jealous that like evil people are stealing your flock.
Never mind thieves. Imagine if a golden cow stole your glory. You'd be pretty miffed at that.
God was jealous of the golden calf. That's why he destroyed it justly. People often call God petty for being jealous. Like, no, it's actually incredibly mature to be like, what the hell? Why is a golden cow convincing these people? That is jealousy, and that is not petty. That is, in fact, a rational thought for the ridiculousness of it.
It's very,
golden
very
cow
low
would be
IQ.
quite a step up for the things people are worshipping these days. But yeah, sorry, Mr. Patriarch.
No, I was just saying, trading the revealed God for, who delivered you from Egypt and did all these amazing miracles. Trading that God for a golden calf seems like a really low IQ move on the half of the Israelites.
Well, if you read Exodus, they call the golden calf Yahweh. And that's the ridiculous of it. Like, this God of the Spirit who cut the sea and never had a physical appearance to them. Oh, he's that golden calf right there. We've made a body for him. Of course you'd be jealous, because God knows the better body is Jesus coming, not this stupid golden calf.
Yeah, it would be like if you were deployed as a soldier and you came back and found that your wife had been sleeping around, and she said, "Oh, well, don't worry. Every man I was with, I was imagining it was you. So thanks."
Great analogy.
Okay, fits of anger. This one seems pretty straightforward. If you come across people who are at a hair trigger to burst into flames of rage, not pleasant to be around, doesn't speak well of their internal character, I would say, not a way that we would expect wise, godly people to behave. Any more comments? Rivalries.
Oh no, I had a comment for fits of anger. Actually, you know that verse in I think it's Timothy where it's like women shouldn't speak in church?
Right, yeah, we should do that one day.
No one reads a couple of verses down. Paul contrasts that sin of like women in the church with what men were doing in the church. A few verses down, he says, "Hey guys, stop having fits of anger and debating what I'm saying. Just listen." And so like that passage it's actually quite equality, equality, whatever the word is I'm thinking of. It both hits at the tendency for women to gossip and the tendency for men to debate and argue. And this is important. Like, the Bible isn't going to just go after one group. It's like, yeah, no, all of you have sin. And for men, it's the fits of anger, which I think you should really have, as we see this primarily in the form of like, the YouTube arguments and debates different people have. Like in this community, I think the thing you'll see a lot with that, or like, different down takes. So, a YouTuber will have a fit of anger and down, like, take down another YouTuber and like an expose or something. These fits of anger that happen, which is also related to rivalries. There is such a thing as like I think people can sometimes put these like fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions. People will merge that into like certain chivalries as like part of being chivalrous, but no, it's not. Chivalry is being noble and honorable, not these like rivalries. 'Cause I'm speaking of this like CK2 as a game. A lot of times you'll have a rival. A lot of people are exposed to that idea from that era of the world through that medium. There's other things that you'll have from like YouTube videos or games, stuff like that. These are all just like petty disagreements that really like it doesn't really matter who's right or wrong because you're both like acted like such assholes that who wants to believe either of you?
I think rivalries can often start being quite fun, quite harmless, tongue in cheek. You don't really mean it. But it so easily becomes embedded and crosses a line and becomes impossible to undo. Maybe an obvious example of this is national rivalries. I think everybody has had moments of joking about, I don't know, for the British, it might be like, it would be the French, wouldn't it? So it's some little sly comment, which in itself is fine. But I think having a long-running, pointless rivalry that you're not attempting to end, that you're actually enjoying and spurring on, will almost certainly result in actual unnecessarily hostile feelings towards people who we should be loving. So,
yeah, no, agreed. And I think if you think about examples in fiction, that's a great place to look. You can find all sorts of rivalries in fiction and whatnot that maybe they started off as friends, but then they're as you say, the rivalry amps up, and then they end up in some cases killing each other, whatever. Like a good example of this, again from a fairly degenerate show, but it's a good illustration. Was what was the guy's name? Anyways, the Ludus, the head of the Ludus in freaking Spartacus. He had this rivalry with this one guy, and basically, it started off they started off as friends, but then he was always grasping and wanting to be more and wanting to be better than this other guy that, eventually he ends up having him killed and whatnot. So I think that's kind of what you were talking about as Batiatus. Yeah, that was the guy's name. So, but don't be Batiatus.
Don't be, yeah. Dissensions, that's another interesting one. Maybe the thing that springs to mind for me here is I have the kind of personality that likes to play the devil's advocate, as it were, or find the problems. I'd like to see what's could be improved in, say, if I was in a team. I'd like to spend my time looking for holes and plugging them, and then sometimes I might suggest something and it is it's overturned as a concept. The idea is pushed aside quite often for probably very good reasons, because the people who are running the project, they know better, they know more context. But the attitude of dissension to me is you're always trying to cause trouble rather than being part of the group, pulling in the same direction. Right?
Don't tell the dissident right.
Oh dear.
That's probably a better example actually than my convoluted one.
The King James version is heresies, which gets my inner Space Marine going. But essentially, I think it's talking about, maybe we could do this little thing differently. And then that even comes back to the old metaphor that he uses early on, which is a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Once you start doing something differently, the whole doctrine will change.
Yeah. So I wouldn't make a secret of the fact that I oppose the a lot of the government's decisions over the last year, but I do have to check myself because I think that's also just my proclivity. I think in this case I have very good reasons for it, but I have a funny feeling that if I was in a world where the government was making all the exact decisions I think would be perfect now, I would flip and be wanting to be a dissident against that kind of government.
Yeah,
You know?
I think in the era of the rights of man, like, we don't realize what depth this terminology meant, because when this was written, they did mean even protesting against the state. It was that like extreme, like no, obey Caesar, and like if you have to, then like, sorry, buddy, you're gonna be a martyr if you disagree that much. Like, you still have to obey Caesar, within reason, I think. But I think there's a certain extremeness to that, like holding account to the believer, that we oftentimes just look past because we have rights now. Before rights existed, this was completely understood to be like, no, you are loyal to your kings and your lords and your governors, and tough if you don't like it, you have to be loyal to them. And to some degree, the extent that Christians took this to the extreme, I think there's a famous quote by Julian the Apostate, the emperor, who was like, he hated the fact that Christians would feed his poor. He hated the fact that the Christians would give money to the poor of Rome rather than themselves, because it made him look bad. Because it made him, and like he didn't like that they were so, because Julian Apostate was an apostate. I think he tortured Christians, but he didn't like Christians. He wanted to go back to the classical gods, and he hated. It was in many ways out of jealousy for how much they cared for the poor of Rome, and he was completely aware that like the Christians were so loyal to the same state that was torturing them that they still supported the poor and the drunkards and everyone who were literally would be in the arena cheering them on getting eaten by lions. They would feed them. That was a degree that Christian, that was the seriousness that Christians took dissonance, that like, no, you're just not going to. You're going to be loyal to and sorry, libertarians, but yeah, this is loyalty to the state in many ways. You can argue against what the state's doing when they're going to kill you. Like, pray for the opportunity. When the guards come to arrest you and throw you in the arena, don't pray for life. Pray for the opportunity to preach the gospel before you die. And that was the extremeness that they were talking about.
I find this a very directly practical issue, because I mostly do think of myself as a libertarian, and I generally think that I would like to think I would oppose the infringements on our freedoms. So I guess I have to think through where does that fit in with the Bible saying that we shouldn't dissent. And there's actually quite a few passages in the New Testament that talk about how I think there's even one that says there is no authority on earth except that which is implemented by God. So that includes North Korea.
Yeah.
If you live in North Korea and you're a Christian, then your authority has been put there by God.
And that's hard. Sense, I don't like this verse. I hate it, because I do want to dissent, but how am I going to do that?
I see
on that point of, sorry, you go on, Mr. Patriarch.
Okay, I'll make it short, Northern Man. But I see it kind of like, because my friends and I were talking about this. We're all kind of in a similar headspace. And I guess I see it as the office of authority is ordained by God, and the people who are in charge, who sort of rule, frankly, are there by God's will. But as we know in the Bible, rulers fall in and out of favor, and they, through wickedness and whatnot, they are laid low by the Lord, either divinely, so like that one king who was stricken with madness and ate grass and whatnot, or the Lord will sometimes be like, all right, cool, well, I'm going to raise up this foreign power to usurp you, or I'll raise up this rebellious faction and have you overthrown. That can happen, and that does. So I don't think it should be total capitulation, but recognizing that having positions of authority is ordained by God, and to try and have a world without rulers is heretical.
Oh, I think we're going to have to return to this because I don't feel satisfied that I fully have a position sorted. But at least if we're not directly advocating for dissent right now, we might win some brownie points with YouTube. You were going to say something, Northern Man.
No, I was going to say something to the North Korea point, because the famous lady who escaped North Korea, Yeonmi Park, she said that North Korea is God's example to what happens to a country without God. And she says it's complete idolatry and servitude to a new God in not Kim Il-sung, his father. I've forgotten his name.
Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah, Kim Il-sung's the original, right? Yeah, it's basically he is now the new God, and he is still the leader of North Korea even after his death.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Funny thing about North Korea, because Kim Il-sung's father was a minister. He was a Christian minister, and so the founder of North Korea was basically a disgruntled atheist son of a pastor. And it's like, how do you?
It makes sense.
It all makes sense indeed. To this day, there is a faction of Kim Il-sung's father's ministry that still professes loyalty to the state, but offhandedly professes Jesus Christ is still God, and it's really weird because they get special treatment because they're the product of the father of their God. Their secular God, the father of their made up God, the Kim Il-sung, still has churches that he founded, and how do you make it's an internal contradiction for their state. They can't go to war against the father of their God, who's supposed to be divine, also who was a Christian, who was actually following the real God. So you get these hilarious contradictions where they don't really know what to do.
British Berean has made an interesting point. He says we should look into the Magdeburg Confessions. The authorities there interposed against Charles V because he sought to abolish true worship.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people are stuck in the situation right now where they kind of wish that the state would abolish true worship, so then they'd kind of be cleared
justified
morally in doing what they actually want to do, which is oppose the authorities. And for that reason, I suspect the authorities will not push people that far. For example, in the most recent lockdown, churches were allowed to remain open whilst just about everything else was closed here in the UK. It seems pretty clear to me the reason for that is that they got a sense that there was actual discontent amongst the Christians in the country that could actually amount to something. And so they've kind of poured water on that fire in the most minimal way that they could, but very effectively.
There was an amusing little thing that happened in America where I forget where it was. It might have been either it was some Southwest state, I think. I forget which one, but they allowed strip clubs to stay open, but not churches. So there was one church that retitled itself on government documents as a strip club, and their stripping was that the pastor would walk in, take off his jacket and tie, and then preach the gospel. And it's well, that's a strip, and they actually managed to stay open by doing that. It was it's the sheer lunacy of the lockdown laws, the sheer lunacy that you can do that is it's a statement. And actually, I think there's a value in realizing that the role of the Christian is not to dissent, but to kind of pervert their laws. I think the Bible is pretty clear that while you're called to obey the authorities, it's really to shame them. The authorities are to be shamed by you, by your obedience. And I think this is something that we should really meditate on as Christians. It's our avenue, our avenue of quote unquote dissent isn't to protest or be violent. It's actually to there's a terminology that there's a whole subreddit dedicated to, but where you're obedient, but you're an asshole when you do it. Or a jerk, not jerk, but you're doing it in a subversive way. Subversive obedience or something. It's a really great meme collection. But
yes, I think I know the one you mean.
Subversive compliance, I think.
Malicious compliance.
Malicious compliance. Yeah. So Christians are allowed to be maliciously compliant. So you have examples of this in the Bible where Daniel was under the law that if you didn't the Persian king had his hands tied to pass a law where if you pray to some god, if you don't pray to the gods of Babylon, you get thrown in lions. I'm misremembering what the explicit one was, and Daniel was just like, yeah, no, I'm going to still pray to my God. And so he got thrown into the lions, and what was his malicious compliance? The lions didn't eat him.
Yeah.
We're not all going to have miracles like that. And a lot of
the lions then posted on Reddit. They were like, my boss told me to eat this really great guy.
Yeah, so like your role as a Christian, if you want to be a dissident, it's not to be a dissident. It's to be a maliciously compliant citizen. And you have plenty of examples of your brothers and sisters doing this. I think the church retitling itself as a strip club is a great example of this. That is malicious compliance. And there are many tools in your toolkit to do this with in a way that allows that. Yeah.
The ultimate example of this is Jesus, right? He clearly had the ability to, when he had the crown of thorns on his head and he was being whipped by the Romans, he could have used his powers to do a sort of Hollywood movie moment where he punches them all and runs out of there. In fact, he does walk through the crowds in a sort of miraculous way, as we saw last week. He could have got out of that situation. What he actually did was he allowed the persecution to carry on, and it's similar to what he says about pouring burning coals on the head of your opponents. And the other thing that it reminds me of is the plot line of the original Star Wars trilogy, where Luke Skywalker goes off to learn from this Master Jedi, thinking, I'm going to become a powerful warrior. And then the lesson he gets taught is actually, you don't use the Force as a weapon. And indeed, at the end of the trilogy, he manages to win the day by not fighting in a way that is quite clever. I think that's the kind of subtlety in God's universe that is beyond human comprehension, but whereby God can use these simple acts of goodness and wisdom in a way that is greater. That is a tool enough for God.
Yeah, you have from the Holy Spirit divine gifts of creativity and ingeniousness that He will give you if you seek Him. If you just take up a sword like a brute, you're going to have the sword fall upon you, because that is lawful for God to do. It's just for God to slay the rebel. It's just a fact. But it is also just for God to give a loyal citizen the courage and creativity to subvert bad things. And you as a Christian should really focus on this as like, how can I follow the rules in a subversive and malicious way that exposes God's love and law, rather than like how can I shame my leaders by my obedience, is what you should ask. You shouldn't ask, how can I rebel? Or how can I destroy my leaders? You should ask, how can I shame them through my obedience? That's the question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, you need to look at no further example than early Christendom or early Christianity in Rome, right? From a heavily persecuted minority religion, persecuted by both Jews and Roman pagans, to within a few centuries Christianizing most of the empire, and then Constantine just finished the job, basically. But at that point, one of my favorite examples was listening to a sermon, or I don't even know if it was a sermon, but it was a lecture by a priest. And he was talking about how there were these, I believe in the 3rd century, there were Greek merchants who, as is their wont, merchants, they went to do some business. So they ended up settling in southern Gaul. And then within 50 years, they had Christianized the entire part of southern Gaul. And it wasn't because they were missionaries or anything. They were just God-fearing Greek merchants. And their living testimony, while still being, loyal subjects to Rome, was such that they were able to totally shape the world around them through their lived testimony. And I think that's fundamentally what we need to get at. And the solution, essentially, maybe not entirely, but in large part, is, be better Christians.
Is
part of it.
That reminded me of maybe a way to like explain what you're express what you're talking about, where you'd basically like your focus is really like as a Christian you want people to trust you so that they believe you when you talk about God, and no one ever gains trust by being a rebel. They gain trust by being a lover of good things. Like if you can, I don't know who you can tell me like who gained trust by being a rebel. Like it's contradictory. You're not going to gain trust by being. You can be a rebel after you've gotten the trust value. Like case in point, George Washington. He had 20, 30 years of military tradition and good actions for his men to trust him. Then he could be a rebel. He would never have succeeded if he started out being a rebel. Rebels don't get trust. They use and spend trust to get what they want. And oftentimes the sword justly comes down upon them. What you can do is like Mr. Patriarch was talking about, they were good Christians, so they got a high trust value. People started asking them questions about God, and they were believed because of that high trust value. We should really think about like how can we increase the trust value? Well, love your neighbor, and they'll trust you, and then they'll start listening to you when you talk about God because clearly you've got something they don't.
Yeah, simple as.
Great. I'm going to suggest that we cut off the discussions about that list, even though there was a couple more to go, and we dive into a couple of the fruit of the Spirit. So the fruit of the Spirit, this is the flip side of what we've just been talking about. These are good things. And as somebody pointed out, one of the things that makes a gift different from fruit is that fruit has to grow. So we would expect to see these things blossoming perhaps over the period of time that you are led by the Spirit. And the top one, of course, is love. And then we have joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And then the very interesting comment that against such things there is no law, which is a very interesting point because I think it's totally true. Regardless of what laws we might be worried about being passed, we will be able to continue with these attributes growing in us to our graves. So any specific comments on any of these? Maybe start at the top with love, which, as we saw earlier in the passage, was love your neighbor as a summary of the whole of the law.
Yeah, I think like at one point Paul says like, all that's remaining now is love, patient. What was the love kind? There's three things he said remain at the end of the day.
Yeah, this is Corinthians, isn't it? Three things remain.
So we should see
like faith, hope, and love or something.
Yeah. Faith, hope, and love was it. These are the things that you should see Christians like growing, like you said, like fruit or things that you need to grow. It takes time. Each one of these things, you'll note, it takes time to develop as a discipline. They're all disciplines. Like no one just wakes up one day and decides to be joyful. They become joyful because they found a way to get joy out of life. No one becomes peaceful. No one wakes up one day and just does this. It's a discipline and a struggle that you focus on and grow as a fruit. And as you do, you can give it to other people.
Did anybody see the Mr. Men stream?
Yes.
So it's surprisingly engaging.
Yes. Yeah. One of the interesting moments I thought from that stream was the pushback that AA got when he was suggesting that some of the dispositions that these people had, that was their monopersonalities, might be a choice, that they may have some control over whether they live their life being angry. And there's Mr. Happy. Now, some disagreement about whether happiness and joy are synonymous, but being joyful, is that a choice? Well, and the way that people were pushing back on him, I think, was saying, these are not choices. These are outside your control, although you can affect them a little bit. It's mostly a pathology that you're stuck with.
That sounds completely Gen X.
Yeah, very Gen X. The kind of Greckian perspective on this might be, No, if you set your mind to it, of course you can control all of these things. I'd actually argue the Christian perspective on these things are that you would expect, if you are a Christian, to improve in all of these ways. So there's actually something wrong if you continue to be grumpy for your entire life. That is big bad news. However, it's a gift from God as you improve, and not something that you can take credit for. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I've talked too much, but I agree.
Well, I'll talk for a little bit then, and I'll make
Go
you
ahead.
feel less bad, Cringewalker. I definitely agree with you on that point, Lambda, about choice, because one of the ones that I really, really enjoy, and I think strikes true with me the most, was, and I really picked on this from Dr. Peterson's lectures, was the property of meekness, because it's become such a virtue these days in modern society to be a complete pathetic weakling and believe that makes you a good person because you choose not to be strong, but it's not a choice because you're weak. And I think nothing emblemizes meekness more than like somebody like Hathorne Bjornsson gardening with flowers. Like, it's the potential to be strong, but the choice to be gentle that makes you a good person.
And in fact, that was a bit of one of my issues with the Mr. Strong cartoon, was the assumption that because he was strong, he was therefore clumsy and would break things all the time. And actually, I don't think there is any necessity to that connection at all. You can be extremely strong and yet very delicate and have fine motor skill.
Going back to the meekness point, this was actually from I heard years ago from Dennis Prager, but it's actually spot on here, where he was talking about meekness in sort of Jewish tradition, sort of used in the context in which it would have been understood by Jews at the time. It basically meant being able to wield the sword, but choosing not to. So basically what you were talking about a bit, Northern Man. So being a badass, but not, going out looking to stir up trouble or anything. So that's sort of what meekness meant in that context. And I think that's a much more, when you look at it that way, it's like, that's the goal. That's what you should aspire to be.
The fruits are gentleness and self-control, not weakness and ineptitude.
Right.
I actually really like the use of self-control. The one in the King James Version is temperance, and that word has gained a lot of bad rep because of the temperance movement in the US, which has been misconstrued, I think, completely. Because, I mean, if anything proves their point more, it's the conversation we had earlier with licentiousness. But the point was that they chose not to engage in sexual activities, which is a heroic use of self-control, because we're all, whether we like it or not, we're all sexually driven animals. So we have to use self-control to temper that.
Having temperance over your own behavior is a very different deal than having a law passed that prevents you from doing an activity, I would say.
Definitely.
So it would be like if you were to ban a drug, and when you passed the act, you called it the Self-Control Act.
That's
quite
kind of
violent.
agree.
I agree. It's the difference between, like, is prohibition virtuousness because it denies people the temptation? No, because self-control in the face of temptation is virtuous, not the inability to be tempted.
Yeah. Whereas these days, I would say, and I'm always making comparisons with our current culture, which is probably unnecessary, because I imagine this is a constant throughout all of history. But the drive is, well, obviously people are not going to be self-controlled. We just need to implement rules, and rules will sort things out. But I think once you've got to the point of requiring rules, you've already fallen too far, and you're beyond hope, more or less.
Yeah,
Not that
I
I'm
think
saying rules are
no,
always bad, but
I think we as Christians are guilty of like picking and choosing what places we want rules versus what places we want to like have the freedom in it, and I don't really have an answer for that. Like I mean, I do think like things like abortion should be illegal, and yet I don't want drug laws because it's like, who cares? And why do I have that contradiction? Because that is a contradiction. Like why am I okay with one being legal and one not?
You could argue that was patience, Cringewalker, right? That it's hard to sit and wait for people to come to the same conclusion as you. That just realize abortion is evil is not showing patience, because you have to wait for them to come to that conclusion. If you force them, then the rebellious street will come out and they'll just think you're some kind of authoritarian.
Yeah. So like, I don't know how to like really resolve that, because like I do think that the law should express what society should be rather than enforce what it will be. Like I think the usefulness of the law is that the law is meant to define what's ideal, not what is. So that's why I think like abortion should be illegal, because ideally it would not exist. Whereas like drugs, I'm like, drinking a beer isn't sin, getting drunk is. So like, don't, maybe I should say don't make alcohol illegal, make drunkenness illegal. I don't know. I don't know how to resolve that contradiction.
Well, it already has certain like drunken irresponsibleness is illegal, right? So like drinking and driving is illegal. You can be in violation of like noise codes or just being a drunken asshole and sort of yelling at somebody and instigating a fight. You could get in trouble for that. So I think it's all kind of it's within the within perspective, right? So like so in most countries, those things would be either illegal or you might suffer some kind of be in violation of some neighborhood code or whatever if you engage in those sorts of things. But as we see in the Bible, alcohol itself is not, forbidden, right? How you use alcohol, that can be forbidden. And abortion is always forbidden. And so is murder. And so is all this other stuff, which is why those things are illegal, you see. Yeah. So I think it's not that we have to ban everything that's bad or ban anything that can potentially be bad. I think that's the key. So it's not about banning things that could potentially be bad. It's banning things that are just flat out bad, that do no good for anybody, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of a better way to think about it.
On this general topic of how, as Christians, would we intend to rule if we were in charge in a government is very interesting. And I have got in touch with somebody who's actually written a book on the topic and has said they're quite interested in coming on the stream. So we might have a stream about that, or even several streams about this general topic in the future. I think we'd probably be better leave it there just purely time-wise, but there's so much more in this chapter, so I'm not ruling out doing another stream at some point on Galatians 5. Yeah. But I'm going to call it for today. I'll give a couple of quick plugs myself, and then I'll pass around the panel, and then we can get out of here. So the first one is I'm throwing open the gates to a vote on Twitter for what the topic is next week. I will post in the chat a link to that. So if you're watching live, feel free to go and express an opinion. The two options are, and I'll keep this open for like a few days. The two options are, the topic is eating vegetables is weak, or the shrewd manager. So that's two different Bible verses about those topics. We've got one vote. I'd like to have more than one, but if there's only one, then it will be about eating vegetables is weak. If it's drawn, I guess I'll have the casting vote. So that's next week. please do. If you've enjoyed this stream, share it around. I feel like there's probably more people around the internet who would enjoy and benefit from these streams than I currently subscribe to the YouTube channel. So I'm kind of thinking about ways to grow it a bit. I'm
you
also
should, the main avenue for growth in communities like this are really to bring on guests to interview for a bit, and then share each other's communities. I could link you up with a few different pastors I talk to sometimes, but everyone here probably could too.
Well, that sounds fantastic. So yes, if we can have a real kind of get together, might put our brains together and our contacts and make a plan of action. I'm totally up for that. So yes, that's anybody listening who's interested in being on or has suggestions for people to be on or wants to suggest to somebody that they have contacts with to get in contact. We're here every week. We're planning to keep on doing this. So let's get the ball rolling on a few of these things. That'll probably do. That'll do for my plugs for this week. How about Mr. Patriarch?
Yeah, sure. I just released a video about a week ago that's been doing pretty good. Apparently, I weighed in on the AA Morgoth discussion, and apparently both of them liked the video pretty good. So that's been going good. So the channel's been growing. I'm almost to 700 subs now.
Very good.
And I'm going to be putting out a new video this week. I'm debating about whether having it titled Jesus Needed Only 12, sort of in relation to partially what we were talking about tonight, or I was thinking about doing one on Lord of the Rings.
Ooh. So when you put it that way, I feel like I should be satisfied with the number of subscribers I have, given that Jesus only had 12.
Yeah.
All right, I retract it. Don't invite anybody else on. In fact, I'm going to start kicking people off the channel. I'm going to keep this thing exclusive.
Yeah, just make it uber exclusive, and then people will want to join it. Yeah, there you go. That's smart.
Well, I hope you make both of those videos, because I also massively enjoy Lord of the Rings content.
Yeah, no. So I think I might do that. Jesus Needed Only 12 as sort of my next video, just because open up the new year. It seems fitting. So it'll either be something like that. I also had a friend in my real life Bible study who passed away from coronavirus. So I was thinking about maybe doing something about like legacy or something like that. So I'm not sure, but I got a few ideas bouncing in my head after that last video I made. I'm just sort of mulling. I'm busy with dad life and work life, so I'm just trying to think of something good that I can nail down. But it'll either be on Jesus Needed Only 12, or maybe something about legacy or Lord of the Rings, but eventually I'll get to all of those, I would imagine.
Well, there's no excuse for anyone listening to not be subscribed to Mr. Patriarch's channel then. Lots of exciting stuff happening there. How about you, Cringewalker?
Well, we're doing another Foundations podcast. Again, to find it on YouTube, you have to type in the Foundations podcast, because YouTube's annoying like that. We're slowly entering the Baroque era, so lots of curvy architecture in stone. It's actually my favorite era, because it's when finally people start departing from the neoclassicals and go into something more interesting. It's like a hybridization of Gothic and classical into something new. Stop LARPing, Italians. You're not Romans anymore. Be something else. So that's gonna be fun. My own channel, I still haven't really uploaded anything. I've been really meaning to do like a reading of Luther's Matthew 24 commentary, because it's one of the rare times that Luther kind of goes a little apocalyptic. People don't know this, but Luther did exorcisms before he was a Reformation guy. So he's got a journal of exorcisms that, like, both before and into the Reformation, he documents like a few different frauds and a few different real things he didn't understand. And it's actually a really fascinating book. I kind of want to go into this area of like lesser known Luther books, like Luther the Exorcist, or Luther the Investigator. He was a vicar before he was the vicar of Saxony. So he would basically go on the bishop's order to investigate like mysteries and unknown things that are happening. It's kind of like exciting.
That would make a great TV series.
Yeah, like before Luther, like a prequel to Luther. And
there is already a TV show called Luther.
Yeah, well,
I don't think it's based on Martin Luther.
No, it's a cop. But I do want to do this because Luther's life before the Reformation is scarcely talked about, and there's actually quite a bit of richness there. He did a lot of interesting things as vicar, and then became a reformer and kept doing a lot of them. But yeah, those are things I would like to do on my own channel. Same name as you see in the chat. If you want to just search it and find that. See anybody who wants to see it Sunday for the Foundations podcast, though.
Sounds awesome. So the Foundations podcast, and then the Night Cringewalker YouTube channel. Hopefully I've put the right one in the description. If you could check, that'd be good. And then Northern Man.
Yeah, this will be I won't be able to attend next week or the week after for the base Bible studies, which would be a shame because I've enjoyed this. But I have to work the weekends, unfortunately. But I'm going to try and join us whenever I can. With regards to YouTube, I am planning to record and upload my first video this week. It's going to be about one of the stark examples of the Chinese economy, having lived in China. So I'm not going to give too many details, just a bit of a tease. So please go and watch it if you're interested. I think that China is this mysterious paper dragon that everyone sees the outside, but they never see the inside of what it's actually like here.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an appetite in our general community for learning about China. So I'd be excited about that.
It'll be good to also have a man on the ground perspective instead of some wignat speculating about how base they are. So that'll be good.
Exactly.
Yeah,
totally agree. Fantastic.
Yeah, that's it. I will try and join in 2 weeks, so hopefully I'll be back on base Bible studies then.
Thank you everybody for joining, and go vote on the Twitter poll. And if you don't vote, you have no right to complain about what we're talking about a week from now. Bye everyone.